So I took youth ministry position 11 years ago thinking, wow, this is a good job to do while I figure out what I want to do in ministry. And 11 years later, I'm still in youth ministry. And I have a great love and passion for it. A little bit more about myself. I grew up in Chicago. I married my high school sweetheart. So we've actually been married 11 years. I always know how long I've been in youth ministry by how many years I've been married, which actually our 11th wedding anniversary is this weekend. So say a prayer for us if you think of it, because 11 years of marriage, you get to know each other really well. And each other's faults really well, and we can always use prayer and grace. I got to know Jason and our friendship has been growing over the last several months. We crossed a threshold in friendship this morning when I accidentally sent him a text that was intended for my wife. Thankfully it was, for the most part, appropriate. It's like, I love you. So I can't remember what came after that, but I know it's something I love you. Yeah, and he leaves, yeah. It's making me blush. He's like, I thought that was intended for me. I grew up just outside of Chicago, and I was thinking about this morning. I was like, this is worth it. And the Cubs Wrigley Field is over 100 years old. Their clubhouses were described as worse than most high school locker rooms. Pretty much just looked like a hallway. If you go into a major league ballpark, usually you would have things like a batting cage where guys could warm up in between innings if they felt like they needed to work on their swing or whatever case. The Cubs batting cage consisted of pulling a net down in front of their television and getting a tee and hitting off of a tee. I mean, that's how bad their clubhouse was. So when they redesigned the clubhouse, they asked Joe Madden, which now the Cubs clubhouse is phenomenal if you get to see a video of it in Wrigley Field. But they asked him, they said, what do you want in the clubhouse? And of course he described all the baseball things that they have. And he says, and I also want a victory room. He said, a victory room? What's a victory room? He says, I want a room that we're only allowed to go in when our team wins. He says, and I want smoke machines, I want a disco ball, I want like a bar in the clubhouse, and I kid you not, the team, every time they win a game at Wrigley Field, they now go into this room before they can enter the clubhouse, and they celebrate every single win. And it's an important part of their chemistry as a team. He wants the team to have fun. If the team is in a slump, he has a reputation for doing things like bringing in a magician before the game to entertain the ball players and try to get them to reclaim their magic. He famously, once, when his team was in a slump, before he was the manager of the Cubs, he was the manager of the Tampa Bay Rays, and his team was in a slump, and he said, I need to change up this lineup. And he says, like, every ball player in the lineup is struggling. They're in a slump. He's like, so I'm going to just put everybody in a different order in terms of the way that they hit. So he decided that if you know the song from, I think his name is Tommy Tutone or Tootin. The song is Jenny, and there's a moment in the song where it goes 8, 6, 7, 5, 3, 0, 9. Well, exactly 8, 6, 7, 5, 3, 0, 9. I mean, it's an old song, and he's famous for blasting music before. So he blasted this song in the clubhouse before the game, and then he put up the lineup card. And if you know anything about baseball, each position on the field actually has a number assigned to it. The pitcher's number 1, the catcher's number 2, the first baseman's number 3, and so on and so forth. So they go down the lineup card, and they're like, we're all in different order, and next to it, it says 8, 6, 7, 5, 3, 9. He put together his lineup card for a major league ball club for a real game that counts, according to the song. They still lost the game, by the way. So I couldn't do that again. But Joe Madden is a quirky guy. This is a guy who led his team to the World Series and broke the curse. And every year before spring training, or during spring training, he picks a theme for his club for the year. Something to inspire and motivate them for the year, and he puts it on a t-shirt. So it's usually a few words. He puts it on a t-shirt, maybe even just one word, and he gives a talk to the team before spring training starts, and then hands them the t-shirt, and then they start spring training. Last year, when the Cubs won the World Series, do you know what the theme was for the year of 2016? Nobody knows? It was you can find it. I know I'm in Texas, so I'm talking about it. get the fanatical nature. But he referenced it in his speech after the Cubs won the World Series. And the theme was, and you can get t-shirts to this day now that say it, "Try not to suck." And that was with the Cubs logo on it. And then when they won, it was either after they won the pennant or after they won the World Series, the person said, interviewed Joe Madden, and they said, "How does it feel to win?" And he says, "Hey, we didn't suck." I mean, that's the kind of humor, and that's the kind of motivation that he tries to put into his players. Try not to suck. He has a different mindset in the way that he approaches the game, and that's a big, in addition to the fact that he's excellent at baseball and excellent at managing, excellent at all statistics, he's very much a baseball guy. But he's got a different mindset in the way that he approaches the game, which gives him that little intangible, for that little variable that separates him from the rest. Try not to suck. The whole idea was that it's a team effort, and every day, every person's got to approach the game of baseball with the mindset of, I need to do my part today. So the way he tried to communicate that to his players is, hey, today, try not to suck. And as long as they every day would do the little things that they had to do in terms of their part as a team, the team would win. I was reading this the other day in Evangelii Gaudium. I've been rereading Pope Francis's first apostolic exhortation. When he first became Pope, he gave this beautiful, if you haven't read it, Evangelii Gaudium, it's worth a read or worth a reread. And in it, he was talking about his vision for the church as a whole. And he said, "I dream of a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything so that the church's ways of doing things can be suitably channeled towards the evangelization of today's world, rather than for her self-preservation." He wants the church's ways of doing things to be channeled towards evangelization, not self-preservation. If I could summarize Pope Francis in 4 words, he's saying to the church, try not to suck. What is the mission that Jesus Christ gave to the church? We actually just read this as a gospel a couple weeks ago. "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always until the end of the age." Jesus gives a mission to the church, a mission that we are still trying to faithfully live out, to evangelize all nations and make disciples. That's our mission. And how are we doing that? In particular, youth ministers, we get the joy, most of the times joy, sometimes the challenge, of working in a particular niche as a lay minister. We get to focus in on one particular demographic, young people. And what a joy that is. Our pastors, who give their lives to the church, also have the great responsibility of trying to serve everybody, not just in their parish, but in the surrounding community, because they can't just serve, if they're truly living out their pastoral nature, they can't just serve the people in their parish. They also have to have the mindset of evangelizing, going out to the local community and serving all of those people as well. That's a huge task. It's impossible for them to serve the pastoral needs of all of the people in their parish, much less the whole community. Hence the reason why they get the opportunity to hire people like you and other people on their staff, and work to raise up volunteers in ministry and to send them out to make disciples of all nations. So our particular job as youth ministers is to go and find the young people and say, either to evangelize them, to bring them into the church, or what the new evangelization is about, which is trying to share the faith to those who are already in the pews, but perhaps haven't actually encountered a relationship with Jesus Christ. And if our mission, according to Pope Francis, is to try not to suck, or paraphrasing it in Joe Madden's words, how are we doing in the church today? And this is the question that has plagued me for the last 6 years, and how I ended up on that interview, which, funny enough, it's a podcast. You can find my website. We'll talk about it at the end during questions if you want, but it's Catching Foxes podcast, which is the only Catholic explicit podcast in the history of podcasts. It's got an explicit nature to it. So they like to say we're the #1 Catholic podcast in the world. And then in subheading it says with explicit content. because they just go off. And at the end of that hour and a half long interview with Gomer and
Mr. Carey.
Luke Carey.
Yeah.
Who's the Archdiocesan Director in Cincinnati of Youth and Young Adult Ministry. I was convinced my career was over because we talked so much about the things that Jason mentioned, the elephants in the room, and we're very blunt and specific about it. I was like, my career is over at the end of this, and then sure enough, like I start to get all these calls. Are we making disciples in our church today? Here's a troubling reality. 1 in 10 American adults is a former Catholic. So if you encounter 10 Americans on the street today, one of them is a former Catholic. Of those who leave the church, when they leave the church, they do so young. According to the most recent Pew study on religion and public life, 79% of those who leave the Catholic Church do so by their 23rd birthday. When we lose people in the church, we lose them young. I had my slides out of order here. This has plagued me, I want to say for the last 6 years. Before we get into that, I want to make sure that we have a common language. What is a disciple? If Jesus says our job is to go out and make disciples, what is a disciple? Because I hear the word disciple and discipleship, it's becoming like a hot buzzword in the church today. And unfortunately, I hear a lot of people using the word, and then when they actually start using the word, I'm like, no, that doesn't fit the definition. And we need to make sure that we have a common language in the church, because if we don't have a common language, we can be talking about two entirely different things, but still using the same words, and then we confuse ourselves. What is a disciple? The word, you might be familiar with it, you might be familiar with the word just in terms of its basic definition. A disciple is a follower. That those who follow Jesus Christ were followers of Jesus Christ. So when we say disciple, we are saying, okay, well, that's somebody who is following a particular principles or teachings or lifestyle according to whatever they're a disciple of. So if they're a disciple of yoga, they live yoga practices. If they're a disciple of welding, or whatever the case may be, if they're learning a trade, they're really truly a disciple of that practice. And if they're a disciple of Jesus Christ, we expect them to live according to his teachings. How do we know that someone is a disciple? What are the characteristics that they would have if they're a disciple? Well, the word disciple and discipline have the same root word, discere, which means to learn. So disciples practice disciplines. So if I were to say, hey, Tim, right? The one name I remember was the first one introduced, of course. Everybody else went around and gave their names, and I can't remember any of them. So I'm going to pick on Tim here. And I know you're new. It's your first day, whatever. Tim, what are some of the disciplines that you would expect if I were to say, Tim, go and find me a disciple in your parish pews today? What are some of the disciplines that you would be looking for that person would be practicing?
Sure. All right, so
you're a Franciscan grad too, so I'm testing you.
Obviously, living a sacrament, like frequenting the sacraments, but on top of that, right, a disciplined daily quiet time prayer before the Lord, and also just their charity, the way that they actually love the neighbor, the person around them, that they actually care for them, love them, feed them, walk with them in faith. So those are the first three things that.
That's beautiful. You earned your degree well. Well done. Yes, they are living a sacramental life. They are, so if they're a disciple of Jesus Christ, we expect them to be frequenting the sacraments, at least if they're defined, if they're Catholic disciple of Jesus Christ. We expect that they have a prayer life, and one that is frequent, is disciplined, is noticeable. We expect that they are, that prayer life is visible in their acts of kindness and their charity towards others. I would say that, and we could probably go around, but it would take a while, and come up with all kinds of disciplines. Study. I would expect a disciple of Jesus Christ to study the works of Jesus Christ and his church and all of its teachings. I would expect a disciple of Jesus Christ to be tithing if they're in time, talent, and treasure. They live their faith in terms of giving to their church. I expect a disciple of Jesus Christ to Be a person, you mentioned service or charity. I think you can put a lot of different things under charity, service and apostolates and etc. Disciples of Jesus Christ are relatively easy to identify because they live their lives differently than that of the way of a normal person. And you can identify the disciplines by which they live. So if our job is to raise up disciples of Jesus Christ, one of the things that we have to teach them are disciplines. We have to be modeling disciplines in our own life and teaching them those disciplines so that they can practice it in their life. The third thing, and this is a distinction that I don't think is made enough in our church today, and one of the biggest hang-ups that I have about the word disciple and discipleship. A disciple is a follower of Christ. The word discipleship is thrown around quite a bit. And we don't always understand when we use that word that discipleship refers to a specific method by which we make disciples. People are like, I see it all the time in marketing for content, Catholic content. So a new Catholic resource comes out, video resource or study guide or book or whatever the case may be. And I've worked in Catholic content for several years, either on the side or sometimes full time. And I know how marketing works. You try to find the hot buzzwords in the church today, because if somebody sees that buzzword, they're like, oh, my job, we've been talking a lot about discipleship and disciples. And then you see a resource that says, and I see resources say this all the time, the greatest resource for making disciples in the church today, the best resource for discipleship in the church today. Discipleship isn't a resource. It's not a resource at all. So the fact that a resource is called, this is a discipleship resource, means that it doesn't have anything to do with discipleship, because discipleship is not a resource. It drives me up a wall when I see that, but it's a buzzword. Don't fall into that trap in terms of discipleship. I want everybody in the room to understand what discipleship means. Discipleship is a process. It was a catechetical process or a formation process that is ancient. It goes well back before Christianity into Hebrew culture. That the way in which young men were taught back in those days is they had schools that they would go through as a young man, and they would, if they graduated from one school, they'd go to the next and the next. And only the best of the best were taken from the top of each class and were allowed to go on to the next class and the next class and the next class. And then when you got to the point where no more school was available, classes were over, they learned all the basics, a rabbi, someone who was learned and high up and had a tremendous knowledge and capabilities, etc., a rabbi would come and evaluate the men in the class. And he would then line them all up at the end of their education, and he would go to each one of them and he would say one of two things. He would say either, come and follow me, or he would say, go and learn the trade of your father. If he gave you the invitation to come and follow me, that means you now had an invitation to live with a rabbi for the next several years of your life and to learn from his very way of life. And it opened up a world of possibilities in terms of what you could do in your life from a career and a vocational standpoint. You now had an opportunity to become the best of the best in the culture of that time. If he did not say that, and the rabbis would only choose the best of the best, if he did not give that invitation to you, he said, go and learn the trade of your father, in which case you were stuck doing whatever job it was that your father did, whether you liked that job or not. So you had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and the rabbis only choose the best of the best. The old saying in the Hebrew culture was that if you were a good disciple, you would be covered in the dust of your rabbi, meaning that you followed your rabbi so closely that the dust from his sandals that was kicked up would actually cover you throughout the day. So your job was to live among that rabbi and learn from his very way of life. Imagine this, the apostles who lived with Jesus for 3 years, imagine what they learned by the way Jesus woke up in the morning and his example, the way that he brushed his teeth, the way that he handled adversity, the discipline that he put into his life in terms of prayer, and how he would withdraw for quiet, and how he would come back. They got to learn from that example, the example of God himself on a day in, day out basis. If you've ever wondered why it is that Peter and his brothers drop their nets and everything behind on the day that Jesus shows up and says, "Come and follow me." I mean, it's really weird. It's like they dropped, the gospel says, they dropped everything that day, left it all behind. And it's like, wouldn't they like leave a note or something? No, they left everything that day. Like right in that second, it's because they're fishing that day. And Jesus calls out and he says, "Come and follow me," which is the invitation that a rabbi gives. And he's providing for them an opportunity of a lifetime. What were they doing when he showed up? They're fishing. They're trades of their father. Their opportunity had come and gone. They were not the best of the best. So he offers them a second chance, and they didn't even think twice about it. In fact, if you notice in the Gospels, Peter is the worst fisherman ever. He never catches a fish. If Jesus is there, he gets the catch of a lifetime. Like, if he feed the entire world with the fish in his nets, Jesus is not there, nothing. You know? So, yeah, anyway, we learn from the examples of rabbis. That's the process of discipleship. So when we say discipleship, rabbis had a handful of people. They were specifically invited into that form of ministry. And they learned from the day in, day out example of the rabbi. That's the process of discipleship. So when we say discipleship, it's not about, well, let's use this next resource and next program. That's not discipleship. Discipleship is about learning from the example of another and having a very intentional relationship of mentor and mentee, or rabbi and disciple. I'll tell you my story real quick here as we talk about the troubling reality. I was a youth minister for 10 years, 10 plus years at this point. I've been working in and out of parishes for the last 6 years. But my first job in ministry, I worked at a small parish in Florida. I mentioned in the beginning that I was looking to do something while I figured out what it was that I wanted to do. Now, like my friend Tim here that I just made, I graduated from Franciscan. My wife and I were high school sweethearts. We got married 3 weeks after graduation. We had student loans, so I was like, gotta get a job. And I knew I wanted to work in ministry. And that was my background, but I didn't know what area of ministry. And I had a passion for young people, but I really didn't want to be a youth minister. But I asked my wife, we grew up in the Midwest, and I said, we don't have any kids yet. And the way Catholics work, you get kids pretty fast. So let's if we're going to do something adventurous, we should do it now. But we got student loans, so we got to get a job, so we can't go be a missionary in Africa or something. So we said, well, where do you want to go? North, south, east, west. Let's get out of the Midwest. We both said south. And there was a job posted that said youth minister, and I at the time, I can't even remember, I didn't even remember that I had applied for this position. It said youth minister, and it said Jensen Beach, Florida, which is a small little town out in the Diocese of Palm Beach. But I just saw the word beach and applied for the position. And then when they called me for an interview, I said yes, and I could not remember for the life of me what the position was. But they called me like 2 days after my wedding, and I said, can I go on my honeymoon first? And of course they said yes. Anyway, so I went out there. I'm a fast talker, and before I went there, I figured out what the position was for. I was offered the position, and it was building a youth ministry from scratch. So it was a new pastor in a parish where the pastor had actually passed away. So it was really old, and there had been no youth ministry in the church for 30 plus years. So teens received the sacrament of confirmation freshman year, and then they were gone. And you can imagine what the state of the parish youth ministry was like when I got there. Now, not to pat myself on the back, but I could go on and on and on about what we did and how we grew the ministry and all the lessons I learned, and that's a whole other story. But after 4 years of working in that parish, it was the largest youth ministry in the diocese, and was largely considered also the most successful youth ministry in the diocese. And then I was eventually offered a position in Denver, Colorado in youth ministry, which was much better for my family because we didn't want to, once we started having kids, we really didn't want to settle so far away from the Midwest. Regardless, I felt really good about myself in terms of the ministry that I grew there. and was actually being asked to give some national trainings by major organizations. I was starting to be asked to do content resources. I had just been offered this major job in Colorado. The Augustine Institute was asking me to consult with them. Yada, yada, yada. My career from a ministry perspective was on an upward trajectory. I felt really good. And the Lord has a way of humbling you when you feel really good about yourself. But I recall sitting at my desk, and the reason I got this position in Colorado is they had a struggling youth ministry. A lot of resources and a lot of time were going into this ministry, and there were like 15 kids involved, and this parish had over 400 teenagers. So having a reputation for building youth ministry from scratch, I was offered this position, and sure enough, put in the same practices in place that I'd put in Florida, and the attendance at youth group immediately skyrocketed. Again, I felt really good about the way things were going. And I remember sitting at my desk one particular week, and I was typing up and writing and brainstorming on the next series of youth ministry or youth group series that I was going to be doing. And I looked at a picture on my desk of a group of 100 teenagers that I brought to a Steubenville Youth Conference 3 years prior. And I was looking at the picture and I was admiring the group, and then I looked at it and I was like, man, that kid, I gotta make sure to pray for him. He's I know him, and right now in college he's walked away from the faith. He's not practicing his faith, he's not going to mass, he's struggling with X, Y, and Z. And I looked at another kid and I was like, yeah, that kid's got similar circumstances or different circumstances or whatever the case may be. And I started counting in the picture how many of the kids I knew were not practicing their faith in college. Then I started Facebook stalking them to find out whether or not they were practicing their faith in college. And I counted the picture of 100, I counted 10 that were still practicing. And I was deeply troubled by this. In fact, so much so that I stopped planning the youth groups, went down to the chapel and just started to pray. And I was struggling with this. I was like, 10 out of 100? I thought I was doing really well, but I'm not satisfied with 10 out of 100. Now, to be fair, those 10 are really strong, devout Catholics, even to this day. They're missionaries in the church, vocations, they're living strong Catholic married lives. They just have a passion for their faith. And I was really proud about this 10. I mean, I was like, man, this is what makes it successful. But then I had the other 90. I was like, why is there such a there's like a Grand Canyon, like cataclysmic difference between these 10 and the other 90, and there was like no middle ground. I was having lunch with Jim Beckman 2 days after this experience. Now, Jim is a name that Jason dropped earlier. Jim is a 25-year veteran of youth ministry, has a reputation for thinking differently around ministry, is a great mentor in my life. So I'm talking to Jim, and we were having lunch. He's like, how's the ministry going? And I was like, oh, it's going great. You know, this is what our numbers have climbed to in this many months, and we're doing this event this upcoming summer, and blah, blah, blah. I was just going on and on about how good it was going. I wasn't about to admit to him the struggle I was having. So he said, hey, so how many of those young people that are coming to youth group right now, how many of them do you think are going to be lifelong disciples of Jesus Christ? And I was like, well, Jim, you know, I was not about to admit to him the very thing that I was struggling with, but he was like hitting it like right on, nail on the head, and digging in, because I was like, Jim, I can't possibly answer that question. I'm like, I just started here. I'm still getting to know the teens. Like, look at our upward trajectory. And he's like, okay, well, you know, you were in that parish in Florida for 4 years. How many of those teens became lifelong disciples? I was like, Jim, you know, let me tell you about my pastor and the difficulties I have with him. And oh my gosh, the parents. Oh, the parents were always just such a difficult age. And you know, Jim, it's not about the numbers. And I was going with one excuse after another, and he finally just cut me off. He was like, Everett, stop. How many of the young people became lifelong disciples coming out of your parish in Florida? I said, 10. Please don't tell my pastor. I said, that's the exact same thing that I saw for 25 years in ministry. I had this small percentage of young people. He says, I had this huge youth ministry, nationally recognized youth ministry, and I had a small percentage of them that became lifelong disciples. He says, and then I had this huge number of young people that came in through the program and left the program and eventually fell away from their faith or struggled with it to varying degrees. He It's like, Everett, what'd you do with those 10 that you didn't do with the other 90? And I thought about it for a second. I was like, well, I had this smaller group that I met with during the week. I called them my discipleship team, which was an excuse for, they were supposed to help me with confirmation prep, and they were supposed to help me with a variety of things, but really, that was just an excuse for me to mentor them deeper, because to be part of the team, I had to do Bible study with them every week, and they had to be there for accountability every week, and I mentored their prayer lives, and I knew their families. I spent the majority of my relational ministry time with those young people. I really mentored their parents and mentored them through the tough issues that they had in their life. I answered the tough and difficult questions that they had about the faith. And he's like, bingo. He says, you know what that's called? I said, what? He says, discipleship. He says, the difference between success and failure is whether or not a young person's been discipled in the faith, whether they have a mentor and a small number of others that hold them accountable to the faith. And I thought about it, and I was like, he's kind of right about that. That if I think about my own formation in the faith and when I really got it, and when I really made the jump from someone who was interested in the faith to a true disciple of the faith, it was because I had a mentor in my life at that time. And I had a handful of other friends that were being mentored by the same mentor. And that he took us deeper. Has anybody ever heard the story of Jan Terenowski? Oh, I've got like one or two nods. I believe he had the greatest impact on the 20th century in terms of its history and the positive impact that he had on the culture. But very few know his story. His cause is actually open for canonization. He lived in Poland from 1900 to 1947 in Krakow, Poland, and he was known as the mystically gifted tailor. He was a tailor in Poland, in a small little village. And he had a love for the Lord like no other in the community. At one point, when he was a young man, he heard a homily that said it's not difficult to become a saint, and he said, well, if it's not difficult, then I should become a saint. And he started reading the works of St. John the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila, and he had a great love for the Rosary, and this was his formative substance in terms of his formation in the faith. Extraordinary prayer life. The reason why Jan Terenowski is known and his cause is open for canonization is because in the 1930s, the Nazis invaded Poland, and they didn't just put Jews in concentration camps, they also were afraid of anyone who might rise up against them. And they knew that young people were the ones who led revolutions. That's why they created things like Hitler's youth camps, is because they wanted to indoctrinate young people into their way of thinking so that the young people would not raise up a revolution against them. They looked at the Catholic Church and they realized that Catholic priests were the ones who formed young people. And in particular, if Catholic priests had youth ministries with young people, they pulled those priests out of the parishes and they put them into concentration camps. This left a void in the parishes. And in one particular parish in Krakow, Poland, the priests were pulled out, and the parish community came together and they said, what are we going to do for our young people? They need to learn the faith. They need to know and live the faith. And Jan Terenowski said, I'm willing to take on 5 young men. And I will take these 5 young men and I will teach them what I know. So he met with those 5 young men weekly, and he taught them what he knew. He taught them, because he loved the Rosary, he was able to communicate a love for the Rosary that inspired the young men. And the young men, because they were inspired by his witness, they learned to love the Rosary as well. Because he loved John the Cross, he did the same thing with them. And eventually he felt confident enough in these 5 young men that he said, now you go find 12 other younger boys, and I want you to teach them the same thing that I've taught you. And so these 60 now young men became known by a group name as the Living Rosary. Of those 60 young men, 10 went on to become Catholic priests. It's a pretty successful youth ministry. 10 went on to become Catholic priests. 1 of those 10 went on to become Pope. His name was Karol Wojtyla. And he was one of the first 5 that were mentored by Jan Terenowski. One of the 10 priests that was ordained said Jan's influence with Karol was gigantic. I can safely say that if it wasn't for Jan Terenowski, neither Wojtyla nor I would be priests. In fact, John Paul II speaks of Jan Tyranowski, at length, and his story is in the book Witness to Hope, which is why we know the story of Jan Tyranowski. If you know about John Paul II and you know about John the Cross, John Paul II's doctoral dissertation in theology, had 2 doctorates. Doctoral dissertation in theology was done on the spiritual classics of St. John the Cross. And St. John the Cross theology is all about suffering. And if you look at the pontificate of John Paul II, particularly the latter years, it's all about suffering. Jan Tyranowski made a saint. And that saint had a greater impact on the world in the history of the 20th century than perhaps any other person in the 20th century. All because Tyranowski said, I want to be holy, and I'll take on 5 young men. He changed the world. This is the effect that one person can have on the world. It's like a paradoxical difference. I call it the theory of one. Eventually in youth ministry, looking at this, these 10 out of 100, and realizing that I was not satisfied with that, and realizing that that in order to do effective ministry with young people, in terms of the difference between success and failure, I was going to have to get to a point of mentoring with every single young person in my parish. And I said to Jim, or Jim said to me, he's like, why don't you do discipleship with every single teen in your parish? Why don't you do it? And I said, because it's not possible. I would spread myself way too thin. And I said, the amount of time that it takes for me to really mentor one person in the faith and pour in the amount of individualized effort. I was like, I can't do that with every teenager. And he's like, exactly, that's the problem in our church today. We operate on what I call the Sermon on the Mount mentality. If you if you realize I have a message that's important to communicate, most of us think I have to communicate like Sermon on the Mount. That those terms might actually not be the thing that comes to mind, but if you look at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, really important message that he communicated to a whole bunch of people. Nowhere in the Gospel of Matthew, where he gives the full Sermon on the Mount, does it say that any of the people that heard the message became lifelong followers of Christ. In fact, if anything, some of them were probably turned off by that message. The only reason we know the message of the Sermon on the Mount is because Matthew wrote it down, and Matthew was one of the 12. The 12 changed the world. Jesus understood this concept. If I work smaller, I grow bigger. So he invested his time into the 12. He communicated his message to the masses, but he worked on the 12 in particular. And those 12 were the ones who reached the entire world. I call it the theory of one. So I started to think in terms of, well, I know I can't reach the needs of every young person. What would happen if we started a couple of discipleship groups or a couple of groups with mentors in our parish, intentionally working with some teenagers on the side in terms of a weekly meeting. I was shocked at the results. I started 2 discipleship groups in that fall, and I said, let's just see how this goes. And I pulled a couple of my core members and I said, I don't care if you come to youth group on Sunday or not, I care if you work with these teenagers on a weekly basis. And those core members recruited those teenagers, they started meeting, and what happened? All of those teenagers stopped showing up to youth group on Sunday. I was like, well, this isn't good. All of a sudden my numbers in youth group were on this upward trajectory and looking great to my pastor started to drop. And I was like, well, this isn't good. In particular, too, because the teens that came that I pulled aside for discipleship groups were like my best teens and really set the tone for youth group on Sunday. And so really the nature of the youth group started falling apart. So I started going to those teens that weren't coming. I said, hey, how come you don't come to youth group anymore? They're like, well, I got my small group that I meet with. And I was like, well, you can come to both. Like, we really miss you at youth group. And they're like, yeah, but I really like my small group. I'm like, you can come to both. But what they were saying to me was, my needs are being met so much deeper in this discipleship group, in this weekly meeting, that I no longer feel like I need this larger group dynamic. And more, I had teens coming up to me saying, can I join one of those groups? I keep hearing about them. And we went from 2 groups to 4 groups, to 6 groups, to 12 groups within a year. In fact, I started to drop off how many youth groups I was doing. And we went to bi-monthly, and then we went to just monthly. And we started to phase it out, and we started to change the whole nature of what we did at that youth group because more and more the teens were thriving in discipleship groups, and less they were less interested in the herd and the large group message. I started to realize there's something to this approach. So what was also interesting is that the youth group had risen up to 60 in terms of attendance, and I was thinking that it was going to keep going up and up and up, but then we introduced this approach. Within a year's time, having introduced small groups, we had 120 in small groups within a year's time. So my youth ministry actually doubled in size for high school ministry, having introduced small groups. And it was requiring less and less work on my part because I didn't have to put in all this work into planning the weekly youth group program. I could just focus on the teens that were in my small group and mentoring the mentors, which was what I was most passionate about. Totally different approach to ministry than what I had learned. I was unlearning what I had learned in ministry. I call it the theory of one. Now, I think you can do a lot of different methods. Don't say to yourself and writing down, okay, this is exactly what I need to do to change my whole ministry. I hope you don't re-envision your whole ministry based on like one thing that a speaker says to you sometime. There's a variety of solutions you can come up with if you understand what the problem is. The problem is we have to individualize a ministry approach in order to take a person to cross the threshold into intentional discipleship. And that's something that is not possible in a larger mentality. That's not to say that you throw out the youth group like I did. It worked for my parish. But it is to say that we have to think differently, like Joe Madden, or Jesus Christ, or Pope Francis around the problem. I call it the theory of one. When you take a person and you put them into the parish for a first time, Tim, this is great for you, and I'm sorry I forget your name, but you're new too. Thank you. When you take a person, you put them in the parish for the first time, you say, envision this ministry. Most people think, well, I've got 600 people or 500 people or whatever people that I have to minister to, so let me put together this program that takes my message to this number of people. And they envision their entire ministry based on that approach. And I always love to get youth ministers in a room together, or anybody who works in ministry, and say to them, I want to change your, I don't know what this means, but it probably means
About
stop.
10 minutes.
What?
No, about 10 more minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes, great. I thought I was going way over time. But I was like, yeah, you can't stop me now. So, this is good, I've got more time. I love getting people who work in ministry together and asking them to envision ministry and giving them this like scenario. And I wish I could just offer this to people in the church, but I said, imagine if your pastor comes to you tomorrow and he says, I've got good news for you, or bad news, depending on the way you take it, but I'm changing your entire job description. I'm taking everything that you're currently doing and I'm giving it to somebody else to do. And I'm giving you an entirely different job in the parish. And this job is so important, I'm going to double your salary. It's like, now I'm interested in it regardless of what the job description is. Unless you're a volunteer and you're in here and you're like, my salary is zero. I'm like, for me. I'm going to double your salary. But I'm going to double your salary now. Here's the job description. Your job is to go into this parish community or this community at large and make one disciple of Jesus Christ. That's your only job. What would you do? What ministry approach would you put in place? How would you recruit that one person? The person can be at any area of their life in terms of their walk of faith. They can be a total atheist, pagan, sinner, or they can be somebody who's kind of on their way. You can select who that person is, but I want you to make them into a disciple of Jesus Christ. Not just a disciple of Jesus Christ, but I want you to make them into John Paul II, because if we understand that John Paul II or Mother Teresa or any other saint that you can name has a greater impact on the world as it is than 700 mediocre Catholics. We understand that one saint has a greater impact than 700 mediocre Catholics. What would you do to make one saint if that was your entire job? I know my mindset for ministry changes entirely. I don't think in terms of, well, I got to run Sunday night youth group, and I got to run this many retreats in a year, and I've got to do this, and this, because that's part of my job description. If my mindset of ministry changes to that, my mindset goes to, and I think it's always an interesting thing to see what people come up with. But I think of, well, I'd invite that person to coffee, and I'd meet with that person for coffee every week. And we start to dive in. And we might put the Bible at the center of our discussions, or we might put something entirely different at the center of our discussions. And eventually I want to pull that person in to pray with me, just to come pray with me. And I might invite that person to become part of my everyday living. keep in mind safe environment policies, but I might invite that person over to my house. Like, I might invite that person to see how my life is lived so that they see an everyday Catholic and how they live their, I mean, my mind goes further and further and further towards a totally different track of ministry approach. Consider this. That's the way Jesus did ministry. He started with 1, moved to 3, eventually to 12, 72, and so on and so forth. And that's how he changed the world. He had Peter. After Peter, he had Peter, James, and John, who were the 3. Then he had the 12 apostles all together. Then he had the 72 disciples, and so on and so forth. It's the way Jesus did ministry. Now, if you're thinking about, well, now I've got to go re-envision my whole ministry, well, to some degree, that's the challenge. It's a shift in mindset. It's why people like Joe Madden rise above the rest. It's because they look at a problem and they say, yeah, all of us are working on the same problem, and a lot of us have great ideas, and there's the typical approach, and here's how I would tweak that typical approach and do something entirely outside the box to the point where people say, that's a little crazy. That's a little crazy. And then when you win a World Series, you're like, Joe wasn't so crazy. That's Joe. Meanwhile, Joe was in last place. They'd be like, Joe, what the heck were you thinking? Because Joe's fired now. So sometimes you got to take risks. But if the approach is 1 to 3 to 12 to 72, and that's the way Jesus did it, I think that there's something we can learn from that. It's not always in what he said; it's sometimes in what he did. We've lost a sense of discipleship in our church today, regardless of youth ministry, parent ministry, adult faith formation, sacramental preparation. Across the board, we don't see discipleship, or what I would even call mentoring. We don't see that in our church today. And this is the difference between success and failure. I'll leave you with this. So here, I'm going to come in under time. There you go. I'll leave you with this. Pope Francis said in the same document where he talks about a missionary impulse, he has a paragraph that he devotes to youth ministry. How awesome it is that the very first document that a new pope writes, he includes youth ministry into it. So he recognizes us, which is awesome. And here's what he says about youth ministry. He says, youth ministry, as traditionally organized, has also suffered the impact of social changes. Young people often fail to find responses to their concerns, their needs, their problems, and hurts in the usual structures. As adults, we find it hard to listen patiently to them, to appreciate their concerns and demands, and to speak to them in a language that they can understand. For the same reason, our efforts in the field of education do not produce the results expected. The rise and growth of associations and movements, mostly made up of young people, can be seen as the work of the Holy Spirit, who blazes new trails to meet their expectations and their search for a deep spirituality and a more real sense of belonging. There remains a need, however, to ensure that these associations actively participate in the Church's overall pastoral efforts. What's the Pope saying? He's saying our structures, the way that we've created them in youth ministry today, are not meeting the pastoral needs of our young people. And there's a need to move past, if we consider the other quote that I gave of Pope Francis, to move past self-preservation and into evangelization, which means we need to blaze the trail of new structures of ministry. And not to be afraid of trying something new and outside the box. I love when people understand the problems that we're up against, and we can speak the same language of that problem, because you can come up with all kinds of different solutions. But I really believe that discipleship is at the core of what we need to be doing. Amen?
Amen.
I'll hand it back to Jason.